I'm going to do a couple sentences on Timothy, but I'm going to keep it super short. So Timothy gave us actually, when he gave us his bio, he's one of the people that adds his purpose, which is to catalyze and coach leaders and organizations to accelerate the journey to become thriving organizations. Now that goes back, and am I wrong or right, Timothy? You started as a consultant at Booth Allen and Hamilton.
That's right. I was a strategy consultant for 9 years, 4 years in New York, 4 years in Tokyo, and a year in London. So
All right.
global
Because then
business
you left,
strategy.
because then you left them as a principal, and then at least that's the way I got to know you. That must have been, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago. You worked as an independent consultant. So I kind of understood that for the most part of your career, you
Well, I,
worked in
I
the
went
consulting
I went
business.
and joined something called the Balanced Scorecard with Dave Norton and Bob Kaplan, where I was
Okay.
recruited in to help develop a strategy execution. How do you execute strategy? And so we developed the Balanced Scorecard and developed the methodology for that. And um, you know, that was a wonderful experience because as a strategist, I was always interested in the execution. How do you execute? Make it work. And so with Norton and Kaplan, we had a wonderful opportunity of introducing a bunch of ideas, including the idea that you need to be looking at non-financial metrics, which was in many ways a precursor to a lot of the discussion that's gone on in
Yeah,
later years about stakeholders and ESG, et cetera. So we
indeed.
were early on in looking at what are the leading indicators of progress, of impact, that are non-financial. So I did that for them for a while. We went into an organization that was focused on transforming organizations,
Hmm.
then eventually as an independent consultant, and then eventually as CEO of a leadership development company. So I sort of say I'm a mile wide and an inch deep. I can talk strategy execution, culture, and leadership change, but only 2.5 centimeters deep on that. So, but
Okay.
across a wide range, 2 kilometers wide, 2.5 centimeters deep.
Thanks for those measures. I think we're gonna get our feet a little bit deeper than an inch. I'm sure you're gonna go just fine with us. The main reason why you're here today, so I wanted to make sure that we kind of understand his experience set, where he came from, because obviously we all know, or you may not know, and now you will tell you he's a co-founder of what is called Conscious Capitalism as a movement. We're quickly going to talk about that to ask him about the founding myth, the founding legend, men and women meeting at a farm. Okay, what's that about? What happened there? So I thought it was cute to have somebody who can actually talk about the legend. And he co-authored at least one book together with Raj and Thomas Eckschmidt, The Field Guide on Conscious Capitalism, which has everything to do about putting it in practice. I know you're serving on the board of Conscious Capitalism, the trustees, and on several other boards. So in summary, it's obvious you have accompanied and are around in conscious capitalism as long as it exists. It doesn't get longer since the beginning. Um, Coming in and having accompanied conscious capitalism, given your experience as ample as you just outlined it, how does it feel now being in the role that you are? Because you, more than anybody else, knew perfectly well what you got into. And I could put a little bit of salt in the question saying, were there any surprises on anything?
Um, you asked about three questions there, but let me focus on
You pick which one you want to answer first.
the why now and why me. And
Yeah.
when you start a movement, you have an idea about what it can be and what impact it can have on the world. And you feel a bit of ownership, like that was our baby. And, um, frankly, over the last 5 or 6 years, the movement's been a little bit adrift. And the board came to me in the summer and said, we need to reimagine conscious capitalism. And I'd been away from the movement for a while. I was living in London. I just moved back to Washington, D.C., where I am now last year. And they said, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? And I sort of said, yeah, I guess you're right. We do need to make this movement more relevant, and we need to be able to accelerate the practice of everybody that comes into touch with us. And now more than ever, we don't need to go into a long discussion about the current political environment.
Mm,
But, we need more great, thriving businesses that are creating really good jobs and helping local communities to thrive. And if we were doing, and we had more of that, then maybe we wouldn't be where we are today. And, it was fascinating. Some of you may have heard of a fellow named Bob Chapman, Barry Waymiller. Bob and I were talking this morning and commiserating over the fact that we need everybody to
mm.
matter. We need to create more of these people-centric organizations. And now is the right time for us to try to be elevating our game. So I was brought in with the idea that we need to elevate the practice of conscious capitalism and reinvent the movement. So that's what I'm trying to do in multiple different ways.
Well, many people were happy because they knew you, and it made a lot of sense having somebody who was both your experience and the insights that you bring to this and the energy. I'm not going to ask you to write something down, of course not. Try to give us a sense, just a sense, almost like a mini SWOT. What, as you come in, I think barely 3 months have passed, so you're still in the, getting fully acquainted. But again, you have a lot of insights given your involvement in the past. What will be your mini SWOT? Like, these are the real strength the movement has. These are some of the weaknesses, and you may want to talk to addressing them later, not now. What
Mm,
are some of the critical threats or mainly opportunities? And you pick
yeah,
wherever you want to put emphasis in terms of what have you seen
yeah,
in that
yeah.
mini SWOT sense?
Well, I want to talk maybe about the strength in a sense to start with. And the strength manifests itself in the following way. Often I will get in a conversation with a CEO and ask, like, what brought you into the movement? And what they say is, in my heart of hearts, I always sort of felt that there was a better way of running a business and or I was doing some of these things. You came in with conscious capitalism and gave me a framework and a vocabulary for describing what it was that was really important to me and that I might have been practicing already. And then, having understood the label and the framework, you helped me connect with others in my tribe that are doing the same thing. So, one of the strengths of the movement is the fact that we do have this language and this framework and this history that when we connect with CEOs around this, they go, yeah, I can resonate with that. And it does touch me and now help me connect with others in the tribe around how to do this. So in some ways, that brand, that strength of the framework has stood the test of time.
Mm,
In many ways, it's purpose and stakeholders and culture and leadership. Those are really core elements that people can relate to and say, yes, I get it. So I think that's the strength. Um, if I were to point to some areas where there's room for opportunity, it's we were in a conversation recently with somebody at uh, at BlackRock, a very senior person who's got a high profile at BlackRock, and they sort of challenged us and they said, well, Whole Foods is great, Container Store is great, and Southwest Airlines are great, but they're yesterday's news. And they are, they've all struggled in their own various ways. Um, how are you staying relevant? Who are the new companies that you need to
mm,
be bringing into the movement? How are you refreshing what's going on? And I think that's been our weak point is that we have rested on our laurels for a little bit. And we're now at a point where we need to refresh. We need to make it relevant again. Uh, we need to be able to um, build on the past, but talk a lot more about the future of the conscious enterprise. And that's one of the themes that I'm introducing is what's the future of the conscious enterprise? And closely tied to that is another dialogue that we're starting to have with brother and sister organizations about the future of responsible capitalism. And what do we mean by responsible capital? What do we mean by responsible business? What do we mean by responsible leaders? So those two elements are things that we need to be better at articulating and drawing in to keep
Mhm.
ourselves relevant as we go forward. And so that's part of the heart of what I'm trying to do.
You mentioned one interesting aspect, and I listened to your podcast that you run, The Conscious Capitalists, with Raj.
Yeah.
And there, in one of them, both of you conversed. You called it rambling. I found it extremely insightful. And one of the aspects you mentioned there, which you just touched on again, you called them brothers and sisters. So
Mhm.
partner organizations,
Yeah.
like-minded organizations. And you talk
Yeah.
about that explicitly in the podcast. I know this is close to some people's heart in Europe too.
Mm.
What is your view on collaborating with
Yeah.
any examples? I'm not asking for announcements, but
Yeah.
what kind of qualities should these partner organizations have? What kind of um, added benefit to complement our strength do you look from them? Maybe you can
Yeah.
elaborate on that.
Yeah, obviously it's a good question and a pressing one that's much on my mind. And I've had two conversations already this morning on exactly that topic. Um, so I'm actively out there trying to figure out what that looks like. And there's a couple aspects of that. One aspect is we have these chapters, and we have this history of chapters. You know, um, we've had some chapters that have come and gone, and we have some chapters and affiliated groups in Europe, for example. Conscious capitalism in Spain and Barcelona, and then we have the Conscious Business Network, or groups that are sort of spun out of conscious capitalism. So one issue is how do we continue to, or take what I call the next chapter of our chapters? We need to reinvent how we work with our chapters. How do we connect regionally? How do we connect globally with our chapters? And for those of you that joined me in December when we were talking about this is an important part of our strategy. So one way in which I answer that is in the closer circle of chapters and near chapters. How
Mm,
do we continue to reinvent what that looks like, so that we create a win-win-win opportunity for our movement and the regional or local chapters? That's one aspect of it. And then the second
mhm,
aspect is um, strategic alliances. How do we start looking at some strategic alliances with various groups that have within them elements that connect to conscious capitalism? So there are a number of business organizations that are out there, whether they be family business organizations or entrepreneur organizations, that we are looking to connect with to sort of have conscious capitalism inside. What does that look like
mhm,
when we sort of start to create an internal network within some of these bigger entities that have been established and around for a long time? In the US, there's a famous bank robber called Willie Smith, and people would ask, well, why does Willie Smith rob banks? And the answer was simple, because that's where the money is. So, when we start to think about, who are the strategic partnerships we want, why do we want them? Because that's where part of our audience is, small,
mm,
medium-sized enterprises, CEOs and C-suites. That's our focus right now. And how do we get access to those? Because we could never spend enough money on our marketing. So we need strategic alliances in that way to start to connect to and make relevant to a new group of people who may be fellow travelers on this. So that's the second aspect of what we're focused on. There's a third area that is, there's an old Zen thing, it's important to have I don't know mind. Well, as I step into this role, I have a lot of I don't know mind going on. There's a lot of things I don't know. And, we're trying to work and develop as we go forward. And one of them is about other movements that are related to what we're trying to do.
Mm.
Now, there have been some false starts in the past of trying to do that, and we're trying to understand um, how can we overcome some of those things that have been barriers in the past. And this is where, I don't know, but I think the theme is around the idea of responsible capitalism. So that's why you'll hear me sometimes talk about that, because um, that starts to take more of a system view of things. How do we have responsible capitalism? And that's in response to the problem or issue that certainly exists over here, where capitalism is in some ways undergoing a crisis. Half the
Mm.
people under the age of 35 over here are questioning capitalism and saying maybe socialism is the answer. Now, it's always curious to me because if you then ask, well, what do you mean by socialism? You get some vague answer, like, what they do in Sweden or Finland, and I'm going, well, you've heard of Volvo, right? And you've heard of Legos, and, these are capitalist businesses and these are capitalist economies. So what
Yeah.
you're really talking about is something that's more responsible capitalism rather than, the current view that we have. So we think we need to elevate the practice of capitalism, and we need to find fellow travelers who are taking that perspective that we need to elevate the practice of capitalism, and for us through conscious leadership and conscious business practices. So I don't know mind, but a direction of travel. Who else is in that area that we can work with? Um, and can we figure out collaborative models where
Excellent.
we can work together? But I don't know. That's a work in process.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now I'm gonna give you a little German lesson. It's interesting when you talked about the example of Sweden, like the Nordic model. You're totally right,
Hmm.
being more social,
Yeah.
etc. The Germans actually have a specific word for how they're called their economy when they refer to it. And this is not recent. It's like 80 years ago when they redesigned more around market capitalistic principles, and they called it social market economy.
Mm,
Soziale Marktwirtschaft. That's exactly what they refer to it. They never call it
mm,
capitalism per se. They call it
mm,
social market economy. That's what they have.
mm,
That's an interesting
mm,
combination. You mentioned something very interesting, which I wanted to probe on, and I heard it in the podcast and was saying, "Oh, this is interesting." You mentioned Willie Smith. I assume it's not an ancestor of Will Smith. Um, But that's where the money is. That's why they robbed the banks. Now,
mm,
you mentioned, and I think you're spot on in considering it and finding out and finding ways how to partner, having, I think, called it an investment day.
mm,
So embracing, and I think it's a no-brainer for people that have been around in this movement or like-minded movements, that the investment money dictates so much of what companies do. The
mm,
short-termism, the
mm.
profit fallacy, the short-term orientation of the capital market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
What are your intentions around that?
Good question. We're taking a twofold approach to that. And one of them we had at the CEO Summit last year. So last year at our CEO Summit in Austin, we had the head of private equity of KKR, Pete Stravos, talk. And Nathan, a shout out to you because I know you're working with Pete on developing a documentary around one of their companies that they are buying and holding. Um, and you know, there's an example of someone who, on the one hand, you can look at KKR and go, you know, they're the bad guys practicing this. On the other hand, there is a pocket there where they're taking an approach that says we need more conscious businesses. In particular, what they're doing is focusing on employee ownership. And employee ownership is a way of addressing the wealth creation issue. And how do we create more wealth for the workers who are actually working inside the businesses? So he was an example of us trying to embrace or work with those in that world that are trying to go down this path. We had a panel with a entrepreneur who was talking about how they did what they called a reverse RFP with investors.
Okay.
So they went out to investors and said, here's our criteria for investment. If you believe in these things, then great. Come and talk to us about how you might finance us or invest with us. But if you don't believe in these things, forget it. We're not going to talk to you. Um, well, that's okay if you're a really successful business because there is competition of people wanting to work with you. And at the same time, we also had other people on that panel who are what you might call private equity or hybrid equity people who are believing that the best way of investing is for long-term sustainable value. Some people are calling it evergreen. Some people are calling it buy and hold strategies, the
Mm.
Berkshire Hathaway model of, and for that emerging group, we're trying to encourage the development of what we're going to call the Conscious Capital Network. And we're going to have an event in the fall where we're bringing together a small group of those people to start planting the seed of how that goes forward. Um, at the same time, we're also hosting a thing we're calling the Conscious Board. So we're going to have an event
Okay.
in April in Atlanta. We're going to have an event on the West Coast in San Francisco in the fall, where we're bringing together small groups, again, about 15 to 20 people, to talk about what does it mean to be a conscious board? Because what we've discovered or learned, and what you probably not news to anybody on this call, that if you don't have the right kind of investment mentality and you don't have the right kind
Mhm.
of board, and what we're trying to push is what we call a stewardship model. How do you have the board think of themselves as stewards? How do you create a stewardship charter? How do you hold the board accountable for being good stewards? How do you even start to think about measuring that or evaluating that? And stewardship is about, we want this business to be thriving in 3 to 5 years from now. If this business is going to thrive in 5 years from now, what's our responsibility as a board? And are we asking the right sets of questions of the chief executive and of the management committee uh, that that works for us? So we're exploring these areas
All
as
right.
new parts of what we're looking at in terms of making conscious capitalism relevant.
I'll have a quick follow-up question before I go question on the chat, which is very interesting. The follow-up question is, there's a, let's call them like-minded movement, different in setup, much more academic in their purpose. You know them very well, economics of mutuality. Well,
Mm-hmm.
they concluded one way to shift the needle is to actually raise funds and actually invest in companies. In all
That's right.
briefness, is that an
With
idea
Gavin
that
Long and
you
yes,
even entertain to explore, even though I'm sure it will take a lot of
yeah.
time to set this up?
Um, well, we believe in leveraging others' strengths.
All right.
And so that's why we're trying to develop a conscious capital network, because we think there's lots of other people who are also practicing this. Barry Waymiller has Forsyth Partners, which is $1 billion fund that they're using to invest.
Okay.
We have this company Rally Day, we have Satori Capital, we have Crane Mirror. There's a number of other companies out there who are focused on this space,
All right.
and they're already farther ahead. Now, I respect what EOM's trying to do in terms of what Gavin Long. Oops.
Can everybody go on mute? And Claudia, can you help us mute people that are not? Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Timothy.
So rather than us starting our own fund, it's like, how do we help
Okay.
engage those, go to the banks. Who has the money? Go to the people who have the
Exactly.
money, engage them, and let
Fair
them
enough.
do what they do really well. And, we can be a convener, we can be a catalyst. Um, and I think that's more our role than it is us actually directly setting up a fund and doing that. I
Okay.
mean, we have people like Motley Fool. For those of you that don't know Motley Fool, you should look them up. They're a conscious investor. They've had an ETF. They've had a fund focused on conscious capital businesses. They have one for large cap, small cap, and medium cap. and they've done tremendously well with those funds. And it's like, well, we don't need to go do that. Go look at Motley Fool.
Well, Timothy, I have some interesting news and connection here. There's a member of Conscious Capitalism, very active here in Spain, he recently retired, a CEO of a investment arm.
Mhm.
And they did the same thing with the help of Pedro Paro, who
Yeah,
did his analysis. And they set up a similar fund, didn't go live yet. He's online. You may look at the names, Enrique Garcia. You may want to wave, Enrique. So going exactly the same route as they did for the same reasons. So it's great to see
This
that having been tried and tested.
great news, and I think we have to better understand what you are doing. And sorry I was late, and I don't know exactly what is Conscious Capital Network, but it is quite interesting. It sounds quite interesting. And Constantine, I think we may take some ideas to develop here in Spain and collaborate in what is a global economy, global capital market. So
Exactly. Thanks.
muy
Thanks
bien.
for showing up,
Thank you.
Enrique.
thank you.
Let's make sure we do that.
Indeed. I'm sure Enrique took a note. I'm
Yeah,
gonna go
I'm
with
having lunch with one of the brothers that founded Motley Fool next week. So,
interesting. Well, we
let's see
know
if we
them.
can connect the dots.
We know them, those that are around, because we had David Gartner on the show like
Yeah,
2 years back, and we had Tom Gartner at the conference. You were there too, in Barcelona 5 years ago.
yeah, yeah,
So we
yeah.
we, we know them, those that have been around. Let me go to the question on the chat and summarize both and give them a
All right.
specific vibe. The first question, they're both connected and similar. It talks, some would even say that capitalism is dead and we're now living in a purely neoliberalism world. Okay. And the other question obviously talks about the same thing about it looks as if anything matters. Things have become worse recently, inequality increasing exponentially, billionaires growing fortunes, etc. It seems we cannot be saved and we need a new system. Let me give a twist to it to, in my mind, a question. How
Yeah.
much of this, let's call it uphill battle, if you look at the questions, that things get worse and opinions get, wow, it really is deteriorating. How much of an evolutionary fix, a continuous staying within the remit of capitalism versus being, I'm not talking about the opposite socialism, but being a little bit more disruptive? What is your sense on how far the
Yeah.
evolutionary path will get us?
Mm. Well, there's two ways of answering that. The first one I want to start with is, we have a systems problem. When we step back from it, we have a systems problem. We've got an economic system, and I won't just talk about capitalism, that's rewarding, the wrong behavior. It's not incentivizing thriving people, thriving communities, and human happiness. At one level today, we know more about human happiness from a psychological point of view than at any time in human history. And
Hmm.
yet we have an economic system that's based on some 19th century assumptions and philosophy. So there's a system problem that we have an economic system that exists today based on outdated ideas, and it has in itself become, and we're seeing some of the destructive endpoints of that. So there's a system issue, which is beyond my remit right now, which is how do we adjust the system so that it's more equitable, that it's not so destructive to the world and environment, and it's more human in the sense of if our economic system isn't for humans, who the heck is it for? And for human thriving. So I just want to put that card on the table and
Mhm.
say that that's a systems issue that is a really important one. And it probably begins with pricing externalities and beginning with starting to identify and price externalities, and that it naturally leads into things like carbon tax, et cetera. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around that, and that's critical to the system changing. Now, within the remit that we have, which is how can we be better than we are today in how we operate more human businesses, right? So I go back to my purpose, how to create and catalyze leaders and organizations that in a sense can be as human as the people that work in them. And, and that's the discussion with Bob Chapman this morning around, we need more human-focused businesses, more human-focused organizations. And that's the future. If you think AI is going to be commoditized, because everybody's going to have their AI application eventually, just like everybody has their website. We will get to a point where AI is more commoditized. The differentiator is going to be EQ. It's going to be the people. It's going to be the culture. It's going to be the leadership. So our goal in that sense is how do we, within the current paradigm, create more people-centric organizations that bring out the best in people and are adaptive, agile organizations that are fit for purpose in the world in which we live in now.
Thanks a ton. Now we have another question on the chat, and I'm inviting, given it's short and crisp. Hugues, are you okay to voice it out yourself? Or you
Yeah,
want to
sure. If the connection is sufficiently
It's sufficient.
Okay. Hi, Timothy. I'm concerned about the engagement of consultants in the organization. So my question is, given the focus is on CEOs and C-level managers, how we can engage consultants, professional consultants in the organization, and how we can maximize their engagement and their contribution at the same time as their benefits.
Yeah. I don't know mind in regard to that. As a former consultant, we have a board member who has just stepped down as being CEO of a relatively large company, who spent 20 years at McKinsey. So he's my thought partner right now on how do we begin to create the journey to conscious capitalism. What does that journey look like as a transformation journey? And how do you build in some of the best thinking about transformation into our model so that we have a complete model? Within that model, there are people who are very good at developing purpose. There are people who are very good working with stakeholder orientation. There are people who are very good with working with leadership. People are very good with working with culture. And the challenge we have is how do we create the model of how these things might play out? And how do we bring that to market in some organized fashion? So, we got to start with baby steps. And so we're looking at creating what we're calling the How-To Academy as a beginning point for that. We're meeting March 18th with a potential funder for a full day to start brainstorming over how we can scale that. What does scaling look like? How do we test and evolve that offering? By working with what we're looking at are consulting firms. So rather than individual coaches and consultants at this stage, that may come later. At this stage, we're looking at consulting firms that have established practices and established business models who want to make this part of their offering. And how do we work with a smaller group of those to prove the concept? Part of this comes from my own experience with the Balanced Scorecard. We had a thing called the Balanced Scorecard Collaborative, which was a series of other firms around the globe that were already established consulting firms that wanted to offer the Balanced Scorecard and strategy execution as an evolution of their offering. So that's our first look, is like, what would a collaborative maybe look like of consulting firms? And then later, what that might mean for individual coaches and consultants, because the reality is we have a lot of individual coaches and consultants, all who have different kinds of expertise. And what we need to be able to provide is an overarching umbrella of how do you go on this journey and when's the right time to bring in the right people. So we're working on that right now in terms of I don't know mind. Stay tuned. It's a work in process.
Okay, fair enough. Before I go to Nathan and invite him to open the microphone, I want to double click and invite you to speak maybe a little bit more about the How To Academy, because the way I understood it, it's not limited to consultants. I think you have some ideas on making it available directly to members, non-members, to help them. There's a lot of entrepreneurs here and CEOs on this video cast
Yeah.
are eager to learn. Give me methods. How does this work? Does this really work? And understood the How To Academy is your answer to enable them even directly, not limited to through consultants. Did I get that right?
Yeah. No, very much so. So, you know, one of the things that we as a movement or we as an organization need to think differently of is we need to think of ourselves as an impact venture rather than as a charity that does things. So we're trying to bring in the idea that we're an impact venture. We're trying to have an impact in the world. We need to measure that impact and we need to be clear. And we need to think like entrepreneurs and act like entrepreneurs. So we need to develop our own sustainable business model so that we're not constantly out fundraising per se, but rather delivering value to the members of our network. So this is where I come back to, we need to make conscious capitalism relevant and we need to accelerate the practice of conscious capitalism. So we're organizing the How To Academy around those two things. How do we help you as a CEO make this more relevant to your team and to your organization? And how can we help you accelerate the practice of this? And so, you know, we're sitting on 17 years worth of content that we have, and which is a well-kept secret. And as opposed to some other organizations that are out there, we have this long history and a ton of content. We need to be able to shape it and make it available in a usable fashion. And we need to partner with others. So for example, with Barry Waymiller, they have a Barry Waymiller University, and they offer certain programs through that university. How do we partner with them to offer that to our members? So we're not reinventing the wheel. Whole Foods has licensed us their learning and development platform. So how do we help take some of the things from Whole Foods? And you know, we have a beta about to start with with one member of our community around how do you take the Whole Foods Conscious Leadership Academy and tailor it to their needs, because you've got a tried and true approach that's worked at scale in a big firm. How do you help move that and make that available to others? So there's these things that we're in the process. It's only been 3 months that we're evolving and trying to put in a framework, and it's a work in process.
Thanks for that. Handing over to Nathan, who will point us to the direction of next generation leaders going into academics, teaching conscious capitalism. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yep, and just that is another great place for us to be impactful, I think. I've been searching around for the right form of engagement there. I don't know that I've got it yet. So I also have the I don't know mind, but would be very curious, Timothy, to hear, just as you look at that as a possible place for impact, if CCI and you have any intentions there, because I know we've got a number of folks from that world on the call here also.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Nathan. And let me remind you, you and I have a follow-up call. Remember, you're supposed to be getting on my calendar.
I'm on it. There's just a number of gyrations that are happening on my side.
Okay, good. The really, really important topic. And, you know, one of the challenges you face in any kind of transformation, what we're doing with Conscious Capitalism Transformation, is what do you start with? And in what order do you address these issues? So we have on our radar screen business education and the next gen leadership for 2026. And that's going to be really important. We've got some people that are interested in forming a next gen leadership council, where we've had some ideas about what a next gen leadership program or network might look like and how we might evolve and develop that. And we think that the business schools are critical. I know that with the Erasmus project over in Europe, you've developed all this curriculum. We know with Tech de Monterey and CEC with Raj, hello Mario, there's a lot of work that's been done to develop curriculum and programs and models. So at some level, you know, we look at the Conscious Enterprise Center in Tech de Monterey and say, wouldn't it be great if there were 12 of those centers in the next 5 or 10 years around the globe, where there were a few universities that sort of said, we want to develop a Conscious Enterprise Center or a Conscious Capitalism Center. How do we do that? What model do we have of that? And then at another level, what are the curriculum and what do we learn from what's gone on at Tech, or what do we learn from what you're doing in Europe, and make it more broadly available? As a short example of this, I was up at one of our chapters, which is up in Michigan in a place called Saginaw, and it's a thriving chapter with some really amazing people involved in it, and a very supportive local university that has a business school, and they want to have some kind of version of conscious capitalism there. So it's fascinating. You know, it's a university that nobody would have ever heard of, but is locally oriented and locally involved. And we need to be able to figure out what that network might look like, of how we can connect to more of those kind of business schools and take some of the good stuff that's been done at Tech, some of the good stuff that's been done at Erasmus, and bring it to bear here. Within our movement. So this is part of what we're going to work on next year, but bit by bit, can't take on too much too soon.
So I'm going to take the freedom now. Thanks for the answer. And I'm personally very much involved and impacted, having co-led, initiated conscious business education. Nathan was intimate to that, and we keep looking for the right formula, bringing it closer to universities and collaborate. So I'm excited about what you said, and I'm sure there's a lot of leverage. I'm going to take the freedom now for the remaining 8 minutes to change to a topic which is very interesting to this audience. I didn't check all the names, but maybe with the exception of Nathan, they're all non-American residents. So one important aspect to cover is many of the things you say, and don't take it as an indirect criticism at all, they typically emphasize in the US. You know, investors you meet there, chapters you visit there, some of the examples you refer to. Do you have a specific vision, and it's okay if you don't have and you apply the beginner's mind to how to bring help or focuses to, and I'm not limiting it to Europe, to the non-US chapters, which, you know, are less, maybe with the exception of some like Brazil and Mexico, less established and powerful. Any view to be more proactively reaching out to them?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the next chapter of our chapters, right? And the next chapter of our chapters has to include our international chapters, you know. We've had people reach out recently from Australia, from Singapore, and, you know, we have a relatively thriving group of some chapters in South America. We've had a start and stop in Europe. And so there's huge potential for us at the global level. And we need to start with first steps. We have 15 chapters that are active in the US at our various states. And we have people like, there's a very enthusiastic group in Silicon Valley that wants to kick off a Silicon Valley chapter, who's looking around and saying, you see the tech bros that everybody's criticizing? Not everybody in Silicon Valley thinks that way. And we need to have an alternative. And isn't now a great time to be thinking about conscious capitalism in Silicon Valley? So in our first 12 months, we're focused on the next chapter of our chapters. What does it take to have really successful chapters? What are we able to offer chapters? And what do we expect in return? So we're talking about how do we offer our chapters freedom within a framework. So we have a very clear framework and a very clear set of what we're offering. And I don't always like the word, but it's sort of like a semi-franchise model. You know, when you buy a franchise,
Mm,
you know, you get certain things that are supplied, and
yeah.
there are certain things that they expect around brand guidelines and other things. We need to be clear about that, and we need to be clear first with our people in our backyard, and then next year start to embrace and bring this out on the global level and see what changes, and bring you into the conversation. Like I said, we've spoken to all 15 leaders here in the US. There's been some sporadic calls, I think, with other places. I think the Barcelona chapter has been in discussion with Aaron, who's working on this, and you know, we'll address that next year. But first, we need to get a rough model up and working and show that it's got some momentum or traction here. And then we'll look at how do we embrace that at the global level, because I think that's critical, that we're a global organization, not just a US-centric one.
Okay, so that's encouraging on one side, because I hear that you want in next year, until you do a lot of homework, be open for business again as CCI, because there was certainly perception in Europe, or the reality of not having been able to open chapters, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Is there any
Yeah.
is there any specific
Mea culpa about that. I mean, I know that, you know, at one point we had somebody here who was saying, "Oh, we're not interested in Europe," and it's like, oh, I cringe to think back that we spoke that way, and two, we weren't we were not conscious enough to see how important and valuable it was to have partners in Europe.
So we
mea
covered
culpa.
one aspect, which is chapters. I do want to double click and see if you have an opinion on some of the activities you mentioned. And I'll just take two or three that we touched on here. You talked how you want to explore using consultants, and you mentioned some names that you're talking to, well, in this case, in the US. We mentioned the academic side. Nathan asked for it. You mentioned the How-To Academy. What I'm getting to is, in which way could you imagine, I don't expect a cookie cutter answer, that any of these specific tools or methods could very early, as an approach, as a strategy, involve Europe or Latin America?
I'm not sure. Maybe ask the question a slightly different way.
Okay. When you refer to developing these initiatives, and I refer to three, it seems that it is possible, kind of unrelated per se of a specific chapter being able to form or to grow further, and the relationship and the role of a chapter. We covered that.
Yeah.
But given the couple chapters that do exist, that they much earlier, much more active, engage and play a more active role in developing, helping, and rolling out some of these initiatives.
Yeah. No, I am wide open to that. There's two constraints that we face. One is, you know, we have 10 people. And, you know, we have to build momentum, and we need to be credible in executing on what we say we're going to execute. And so part of being a new CEO is exactly that, building momentum and executing really well on a smaller set of things first,
Okay.
with a vision to being opportunistic as other opportunities come up. So right now, a lot of my focus is on these things that we talked about within the constraints of the US. And secondly is we need to have the funding to be able to do these things. And so we are out developing and raising what we call our Elevate Fund, which is what we look at as our investment money to build this capability. So one of the problems conscious capitalism has had in the past is it's been run on a pay-as-you-go model. And the result is that we never got ahead of ourselves. We never were able to invest in building capability and building these offers. And so I've stepped back and sort of said, no, we need to raise funds. And so a good deal of what I'm also doing is raising funds. We've raised $1 million in the last 2 months for our Elevate fund. We have another couple million that we're aiming to raise over the rest of the year to be able to invest in the capability so that we can support these things. So for example, in our chapter model, we need to be able to have a really strong platform for our chapters. Just call it an admin platform to start with, and that everybody can use, and it's easy to use, and it's easy to communicate with us. And I mean, that's just one example of value that we can add, so that every chapter doesn't have to have its own systems. We need to be able to make selective investments with our chapters in experimenting on certain things. But in order to do that, we need to have a fund that's got some money in it that we can say, hey, you want to do something in Barcelona? Brilliant. We'll invest $10,000 with you to do experiment. We expect you to match that, and then we'll together figure out how we can use that money effectively. So that's where we want to be going. And that's where I start looking at 2026 as being an example where we start to experiment with these things. And I don't know if that answers your question. So if I didn't, ask me it again.
I think it does perfectly well, accepting that. And we're kind of going to wrap up where you started. There's actually, I don't know mind. Buddhists call it a beginner's mind. A beginner's mind that you're very open to explore, and there are certain certainties you can't provide, but it's clear that you need time to lay the foundation, set up the tools and the methods, and that a precursor actually needs the investment to do so. That's perfectly understandable. So that gives great context. And with that, let me thank you, Timothy. This was exciting. One measure of excitement in the crowd is that the crowd barely shrunk. There were only 3 people that left meanwhile. They were all listening intensively. So this was great. Obviously, this recording is going to be made available on our channels in the next day or 2. This was really appreciated. I invite everybody who did not go live with the camera, maybe you quickly go with the camera and wave a quick bye-bye to Timothy. And thanks, guys. You make this a dialogue through your questions and participation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.